The Buddha's wisdom is long-term, why just being present is a trap. The Buddha tells about how there was a time when he had a vision of the world. It was like a stream drying up, and in the stream there were fish fighting one another over what little water was left. Of course, no matter who won the battles, they were all going to die as the water dried up totally. Everywhere he looked, everything was already laid claim to. If he was going to find happiness in the world, he was going to have to fight people off. This gave rise to a strong sense of what's called samvega. This word can be translated as terror, dismay, a strong sense that you're trapped in a world where the only happiness that can be found in the world has to be fought for. There has to be conflict. But then he said he turned around and looked inside. He saw the real problem was not out there. It was in the heart. There was an arrow in his heart. If he could remove the arrow, then that would be the end of the problem. In other words, the reason he was looking for happiness outside was because of that pain in his heart. But if he could remove the pain, then there would be no need to look outside. So he looked inside. The big picture. Then, on the night of his awakening, he had some more visions. The first set of visions was of his many previous lifetimes. After he had gotten into concentration, he posed a question in his mind: was I born before this? He saw that he could remember back many, many eons. An eon is the life of a universe. They used to say that our universe started with the Big Bang, but now with the new telescope they've discovered that, no, it goes back much further than that. And it doesn't show any sign of ending anytime soon. That's one eon. He remembered his previous lifetimes back many thousands of eons, but he saw that his lives didn't make any steady progression. They'd go up, and they'd go down, and then up and down, up and down, up and down. He said it was like a stick being thrown up in the air. Sometimes it would land on this end. Sometimes it would land on that end. Sometimes splat in the middle. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason. Then he had the second vision of the night in which he posed the question: what is it that determines these ups and downs, the this end or that end or the splat in the middle? He had a vision of all the beings in the universe dying and being reborn in line with their karma, and he saw that karma was very complex. It's not the case that you do one bad thing in this lifetime and you go to a bad place, or one good thing and you go to a good place. He saw you can do all kinds of different things. But the important point was, if you did something wrong and then you saw that it was wrong, you made up your mind to change. You developed right view, and you carried that right view all the way through death. Then you'd go to a good place. Vice versa. You did good things, but then you finally decided there was nothing really good about doing good. You didn't see any immediate results. You developed wrong view and carried wrong view all the way through death. Then you'd go down. But it's because he looked at the larger picture that he could see the pattern and make sense of it, even though it was complex. When he looked only at his own lives, there was no clear pattern at all. So it's important, as he saw, to take that larger view, to look at the big picture. But the big picture taught him that if you want to get out, you have to focus on what you're doing right now, because the power of the mind in the present moment that can counteract the results of previous actions is quite strong. The question was, could he use that power to get out? And he found that he could. That was his third knowledge of the night. So think about that as you sit down to meditate. Often we come to the meditation with the narrative of the day, and we jump right into the present moment. What we see in the present moment is very much colored by that narrative. What was good about the day, what was not good about the day, what you did well, what you did that wasn't so good. Thiken. If the meditation doesn't go well, that becomes part of the narrative. The Buddha got around that by taking a step back, taking in the big picture so that he gained a sense of the importance of actions. But he also began to see it in more impersonal terms, and the big picture did give him a continued strong sense of samvega. You've got to get out. So it's good every time you sit down to meditate to have a sense of the larger picture. This is one of the reasons why we think about goodwill for all before the meditation session begins. At the very least, it helps us to get out of our narratives. You start with, "May I be happy," and then you say, "Well, may all beings be happy." That expands your mind, expands your vision. You realize that even though you're going to be focusing on the present moment, it's not just for the sake of the present moment, it's also for the sake of the future. We hear so much about the wisdom of just being in the present, but the Buddha didn't define wisdom or discernment that way. He said that wisdom or discernment starts with the question, what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term harm and suffering? The wisdom lies in taking the long view, realizing that happiness will depend on your actions. And where do you work on your actions? You work on them right here. You can see this in the Buddha's definition of what he calls the 3 kinds of fabrication: bodily, verbal, and mental. Right now, as you're sitting here meditating, bodily fabrication is the way you breathe. Pay a lot of attention to that. Verbal fabrication is the way you talk to yourself, what the Buddha calls directed thought and evaluation. You choose a topic to think about, and then you make comments, ask questions. Pay attention to that too. Keep it focused on the breath. And there's mental fabrication, perceptions, the labels you put on things, and then feelings. Feeling tones of pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. Pay careful attention to that. These are the things you use to take the raw material provided by your past karma and turn it into your experience of the present moment. And they're all right here. The breath is right here. Your inner conversation is right here. Perceptions and feelings are right here. But the Buddha also talks about these 3 kinds of fabrication over the long term, in which case bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication simply are the bodily, verbal, and mental karma that leads to results later on in this life and on into future lives. Some people say that the 2 ways of understanding these 3 kinds of fabrication, in the moment and acting between lifetimes, are not connected. But how can that be so? The way you breathe is what allows you to move your body, to do anything at all with the body. When you're going to speak out loud, you first have to speak inside. And when you think about things, you have to have perceptions. You have to have feelings. So when you're here in the present why, you're dealing with the immediate raw material of those actions that are going to have long consequences. So, we're here for the present moment and for the future. It's always important to keep that in mind. We can't stay totally in the present moment, because if you can't remember the lessons you've learned from the past, what are you going to do? And if you don't prepare for the future, you're leaving yourself unguarded. But we can learn from the past. That's what mindfulness is for. Mindfulness doesn't mean being non-judgmental and aware of the present moment. Mindfulness means the faculty of your active memory. When you call things to mind, keep them in mind. And particularly, you want to call to mind and keep in mind what lessons you've learned about how to get the mind to settle down, and once it's settled down, what to do with it. At the same time, you focus on the present to develop the skills you're going to need to deal with the big issues that are sure to come later on in life. Think about the Buddha and his initial impulse to go out into the forest. As he reflected on aging, illness, and death, he realized that his whole life up to that point had been spent in looking for happiness in things that would age, grow ill, and die. The question was, where does that lead? It leads nowhere. When you're in the midst of these things, they seem to offer pleasure. But if you take the big picture, you begin to realize, where are the sensual pleasures that you had last week? They're gone. What's left is the karma, the things you did in order to get them, and if you did unskillful things to get them, that's a loss. This is why the Buddha tells you to think about the long term. This is where the wisdom comes in, thinking about the long term, and then do what you can to look for happiness that really lasts. The Buddha wasn't a killjoy. As he said, if you're looking for happiness in this lifetime, you should have initiative. In other words, you don't just sit around and say that you're letting go. There's work to be done. When you gain results from that work, you look after them. You take care of them. You don't squander them. Then you live your life in line with your income. Don't be too frugal. Don't be miserly. Of course, you don't want to be a spendthrift, but don't be miserly. That's interesting. The Buddha says to get some pleasure out of your wealth. Get some pleasure out of your talents, because if you can't get pleasure out of them, you become a shriveled up person and you resent everybody else's happiness. The question is, which kind of pleasures are harmless and which ones are not? This is where you have to look at yourself honestly. When you indulge in certain pleasures, what happens to your mind state? And what are you doing to other people? You want to be responsible in your search for happiness. The same with humor. We don't think of the Buddha as a humorous person, but there are a lot of instances in the canon where it shows that he had a sharp sense of humor. There's the case of the monk who had psychic powers. In fact, a lot of the instances of humor in the canon have to do with psychic powers, accepting that they're real, but also accepting that they're not what we're here for. They're like games. In this case, the monk, Ven Sagata, had stayed in a shrine devoted to a fire-breathing serpent, and he was able to tame the fire-breathing serpent. Word of this got out, and lay people said, "Boy, we want to make merit with this guy." So they went to ask some monks, what is something the monks usually don't get in their alms round? Well, they asked the wrong monks, a group called the Group of Six, and the Group of Six said, "We don't often get hard liquor." So the next day, all the people of the city prepared a little bit of hard liquor for Sagata. He takes a drink here, a drink there, a drink here, a drink there, and then he passes out at the city gate. The Buddha comes along with some other monks. They see Sagata, so they take him back to the monastery. They lay him down on the ground with his head toward the Buddha. Well, he doesn't know where he is, so he tosses and turns until he's got his feet pointed at the Buddha, which you don't do in India. The Buddha asked the monks, "Didn't he used to show respect to us before?" "Yes." "Is he showing respect now?" "No." "And didn't he do battle with the fire-breathing serpent before?" "Yes." "Could he do battle with a salamander now?" "No." There are lots of stories like that in the canon that show that the Buddha was not a killjoy. It's just that he said, if you really sincerely want to be happy, you've got to think about the long term. That's where the wisdom lies. And also think about what your actions have to do with the long term, realizing that long-term happiness is better than short-term, and it's going to depend on your actions. So as you meditate, it's not just a matter of being in the present moment. We're in the present moment to develop some skills that we're going to need to deal with the big problems in life now and into the future. When aging comes, when illness comes, when death comes, you've got to be able to keep your mind focused, to get some control over your thoughts so that they don't run wild, and use the power of the mind to help. Sometimes the power of the mind can actually help cure an illness. Even if it doesn't cure the illness, you can be ill but not suffer. You can grow old and not suffer. You can die and not suffer because you've trained the mind. Now, is this something we get from our educational system? No. They have other designs on us, but for the sake of your own true happiness, this is what you've got to think about. You've got to take on the training yourself. Nobody's going to impose it on you. But the facts of aging, illness, and death, they push you, so you'd be wise to prepare. Disenchantment. We all practice for the sake of happiness, for a happiness that goes deeper than ordinary pleasures. But in coming to the practice, we often bring assumptions about happiness, how it works, why we're unhappy, what we can do to be happier. Assumptions that we're hardly even aware are assumptions because we assume them so strongly. We just take it for granted that they're true, and sometimes they get in the way. Two of the most common assumptions are ones that get most in the way. The first is that we're unhappy because we can't accept the way things are, that the purpose of the practice is to learn more acceptance. In other words, we're essentially neurotic, as in that old distinction between neurosis and psychosis. The psychotic person thinks that 2 + 2 = 5. The neurotic person knows that 2 + 2 = 4, but hates them for it. Our problem is that we simply can't accept the way things are. If we could only learn how to accept that 2 + 2 does equal 4 and it's perfectly fine, then we'd be happy. And so, in that model, the purpose of the practice is to learn acceptance. But even Freud recognized that getting people past their neuroses would not solve the problem of happiness. As he said, it would simply lead them to the level of ordinary, everyday misery. And yet part of the common theory says, well, you have to learn how to accept that because that's just the way things are. Another model is that we're unhappy because we have a sense of separateness. Inside, we're divided. Outside, we're separate from other people. We're separate from nature. All we need to learn is how to develop a sense of oneness, a sense of interconnectedness, and then we'll be happy. But that's not how the Buddha saw interconnectedness. He saw that the way things are interconnected in terms of cause and effect is actually a cause for suffering. And even a sense of oneness, he says, is inconstant. It contains a subtle sense of stress. If you cling to it, you're going to suffer. There's a passage in the canon where he describes the highest form of oneness, which is the oneness or non-duality of consciousness, in which you have a sense of consciousness as a totality, containing everything. Yet even that, he says, is inconstant, stressful, and not self. What these two ideas about happiness have in common is that the way things are out there is already a given, and we're simply on the receiving end of what's given. So we have to learn how to develop the proper attitude to what's already there. Accept and try to find oneness within the way things are. But the Buddha's take on things is different. Reality is only partly a given. We are also shapers of our reality. We have an active role in shaping every present moment that we experience. Now, the present moment is not entirely plastic, entirely responsive to everything we want out of it. Some of it is formed by influences coming in from the past, but part of it comes from our intentions in the present moment. In this way, we are both producers and consumers. We produce our suffering, and then we consume our suffering. We produce our pleasures, and we consume our pleasures. Understanding this point helps to open the road to a deeper happiness, because there is a happiness, the Buddha said, that is not produced and not consumed. It just simply is. But the way we keep feeding on the happiness we produce gets in the way. So for him, the purpose of the meditation is not to celebrate oneness or to celebrate acceptance. It's to develop two very different kinds of emotions, disenchantment and dispassion. The Pali word for disenchantment, nibbida, also means distaste, disgust, or revulsion, which may sound strong, but it needs to be strong. It's an antidote to our strong attachment to feeding on things. That attachment, the Buddha said, is the essence of suffering. The word upadana, which means clinging, also means the act of eating, of taking sustenance. He says that upadana lies at the essence of suffering and stress. So what we need to learn is how to look at the things we feed on until we develop a strong sense that we don't want to feed on them anymore. Now, to get to that point, the Buddha does have us develop a certain amount of acceptance and a certain sense of oneness. This is what the practice of concentration is all about. You start by focusing on one object, like the breath, and then you stay with it long enough that you start developing a sense of oneness with it. Your awareness of the breath and the breath itself seem to become one and the same thing. There's a sense of unification, Ikodhibhava, which the Buddha has us develop as much as possible. And he has us take that sense of oneness as far as it can go through the levels of concentration. Why? Because he wants us to feed on that and then to start comparing this food with the other things we've been feeding on, to see that this is a much more refined pleasure, a more satisfying form of nourishment. The pleasure it gives is blameless, the pleasure that comes from just focusing your mind. The pleasures we get from things outside contain a certain amount of blame in that our taking pleasure means that other people, other animals, have to work, have to suffer in one way or another. An example is physical food. As we eat physical food, we gain pleasure, but to get that food to our plate or into our bowls requires a lot of work and sacrifice. So, as the Buddha said, that's a pleasure that contains some blame. Or in Ajahn Lee's terms, it contains some kamic debts, whereas the pleasure that comes simply from learning how to focus on your breath is not placing a burden on anyone. So it's a type of food for the mind that's really worth developing. As you develop a sense of oneness with the food of concentration, you look at the other ways the mind has been feeding on things for its emotional pleasures, and you realize that they're pretty miserable. The image the Buddha gives in the canon is of a blind person who has been given a soiled, oily rag by someone who says, "Look, this is a nice, clean, white piece of cloth." The blind person takes the oily rag and gets very possessive of it, thinking that it's a nice, clean, white piece of cloth. But when a doctor eventually cures the blind person of his blindness and he can start seeing, the first thing he looks at is his cloth. He realizes that it's not nice, clean, and white. It's a dirty and oily rag. He says, "Wow, I was really fooled by that guy." In the same way, the Buddha says that once you attain the first taste of awakening, you look back on your old pleasures and realize how you've been fooled by the mind. That in finding your pleasure, what you've been feeding on is just forms and feelings and perceptions and thought constructs and consciousness, which, when you really look at them very carefully, are not worth feeding on at all. There's a story they tell about the American occupation of Japan after World War II. There were some cooks in Japanese restaurants who were really upset by the fact that they had lost the war, and now they had to prepare food for the occupiers. So, to get some revenge, they would take human excrement and prepare it with all kinds of wasabi or whatever to mask the taste, and then serve it to their American customers. They would feed the occupiers shit, basically, and the occupiers didn't know. So the cooks got their perverse pleasure that way. If you look at what you've been taking as food for the mind, you realize that it's just the same sort of thing, that all the pleasure was in the preparation. This is why we have the contemplation of the 32 parts of the body, the analysis of things in terms of the aggregates, in terms of the sense media, in terms of the properties. So we can realize that the food of lust or possessiveness we've been feeding on with regard to the body is really not based on much. It doesn't give us any real sustenance, and the pleasure we get out of it is certainly not worth all the effort that goes into dressing it up. The purpose of this contemplation is to gain that sense of nibbida, disenchantment or revulsion, with the food we've been consuming so that we won't want to eat it anymore. When you decide you don't want to eat it, you turn around and look at the fact that you've been preparing this food all along, and you realize you don't want to prepare it any longer. That's dispassion. You've had a passion for creating this food out of form, feeling, whatever. That's why it was there as food. But once you gain a sense of dispassion for it, you stop creating it. And when you stop creating it, it's no longer there. That's when you experience cessation. The mind is no longer entangled either in the process of production or in the process of consumption. That's when it's freed. It opens to the happiness that's there when you're not so wound up or enthralled in production and consumption of all these miserable forms of food. So the Buddha's take on true happiness is very different from a lot of the assumptions we tend to bring to the practice. It's important to keep this fact in mind. We're not totally on the receiving end of things. We're producers and consumers at the same time. And the producing and consuming of our ordinary pleasures, or even some of our more refined pleasures, is what's getting in the way of realizing a happiness that goes beyond all this, that's not dependent on being connected or unconnected. It's not dependent on accepting or not accepting. It's just there. But to find it, we have to develop a sense of disconnect with our old enthrallments, and we have to decide not to accept the way things have been. In this way, the Buddha has a very different approach to how and where to find true happiness. But the happiness that comes is a lot truer than anything that can come from simply learning how to accept things or learning how to become one with them. So try to keep this point in mind, that you're both a producer and a consumer, and take a good, hard look at what you've been producing and how you've been consuming it. Look at all the effort that goes into producing happiness out of this body we have, out of feelings and perceptions and thought constructs and consciousness. Start asking yourself, is it really worth all the effort? Maybe there's something better. Maybe it's time to grow up. When you can develop that sense of disenchantment and dispassion, it leads to cessation. Then you realize that cessation is not a scary thing. It's not like extinction. It's more like learning how to outgrow some old bad habits, your old addictions, your old intoxications, and finding that there's something a lot better there when you put your old feeding habits aside. A mind larger than the world. Years back, when I was working on the book, The Buddhist Religions, I sent the manuscript to a scholar who was an expert in early Mahayana. I had her read through the book, and she was surprised at a point I was making about Theravada, which is that most people in Theravada countries don't think of themselves as following the Noble Eightfold Path. Instead, they're developing the 10 perfections. She thought that the perfections were a Mahayana invention. Actually, they came before Mahayana split off, and they really are a powerful way of understanding how Buddhism is practiced in Southeast Asian Theravada countries, because they deal with the virtues you need, the virtues you develop as you go through daily life. Some of them are related to meditation, like renunciation, which doesn't mean just giving up pleasures. It means giving up sensuality, your fascination with sensual thoughts, and finding your pleasure in concentration instead. Others have to do more with dealing with other people. As the Buddha said, when you're dealing with other people, you have to develop equanimity, you have to develop goodwill, kindness, and endurance. The other people will benefit, and you'll benefit from those virtues too, because all of them play a role in your meditation, especially the endurance. So there's a special need for developing these qualities as you deal with other people. So, as you think of bringing the practice of Dhamma into your daily life, or better yet, bringing your daily life into the practice of the Dhamma, think of the perfections as the overarching set of Dhammas that provides your framework. They can all be explained under one perfection, which is the perfection of determination. I was mentioning yesterday how someone was surprised at how much goal orientation there was in some of my books. He saw it as a flaw. But think about the Buddha. He was extremely goal-oriented, probably the most goal-oriented person in history. He left home because he had a goal, and he kept on practicing, even in spite of many false starts, because he held to that goal. Even after he attained the goal, he continued having further goals. He decided he would set up the Dhamma and Vinaya so that it would last for a long time. That was a big project. Gaining awakening took 6 years. Setting up the Dhamma and Vinaya took 45. Every time he gave a talk, it was with a purpose. If he could get people to gain awakening by listening to the talk, that's what he would try to bring about. If he realized that they were not ready for that yet, he would try to send them in the right direction. He didn't just give talks as a matter of ceremony. He didn't teach as a matter of ceremony. He taught with a purpose. So, when you're thinking about bringing your life into the practice of the Dhamma, what is your purpose? What is your goal? Think about that. The Buddha would recommend that you make your ultimate purpose the end of suffering. Then you have to think about what you have to do in order to get there. Which aspects of your life are getting in the way? Which aspects of your life are helpful? You want to sort things out in line with that standard. Then you think about the 4 qualities that go into a good determination. You start with discernment, just as the noble path starts with right view. You want to have a clear idea of what would be a worthwhile goal for your life and of what you have to do in order to get there. Now, under discernment, the Buddha would also list goodwill. At one point he said, if you have ill will for other people, that's wrong view, not just wrong resolve, wrong view as well. But goodwill doesn't mean simply being nice to other people. It means thinking about what true happiness would be for you and for others, what you have to do in order to bring about true happiness. Use your discernment for that. That's where discernment and goodwill come together. You could use your discernment for all kinds of goals, but if you make your goal true happiness, it means you have to have goodwill for yourself. If you want your happiness to last, you have to have goodwill for others too, because if your happiness depends on their suffering, they'll do what they can to stop it. You also have to realize that their true happiness will have to come from their actions. So, when there are times when someone is going to do something unskillful and you can actually prevent it, that's an aspect of goodwill. They may not like it, but as Ajahn Fuang used to say, we're not here to get other people to like us. We're nobody's servant. Nobody hired us to practice. Nobody hired us to be born. Still, we think of their happiness because it has a bearing on our happiness. We think of their happiness in terms of their acting in skillful ways. Our happiness comes from our acting in skillful ways. This is why we're not Buddhist doormats. There is that image where the bandits have pinned you down and they're sawing you into little pieces with a 2-handled saw. And that's a case where they've overpowered you. There's nothing you can do. You just spread goodwill, starting with them and then out to the whole cosmos. That's for your happiness, because if you were to die at that moment with ill will in your heart, you'd be reborn in line with that ill will, probably with a desire for revenge. And a life devoted to revenge is not a happy life. But if you can maintain goodwill in situations where you're totally overpowered, that means your mind is larger than the situation. That's a lot of what Dhamma practice in daily life is, making your mind larger than the situation, thinking about what would be for the true happiness of everybody all around. That's the first aspect of a good determination, discernment, which encompasses discernment and goodwill. The second aspect is truth. This also covers virtue, right effort, and endurance. Once you've decided that you have a goal, you stick with it and you do what needs to be done. Whether you like it or not, whether it's easy or not, you try to be true to your goal. Otherwise, it's not a goal anymore. The third quality is generosity. Generosity here can cover giving up unskillful attitudes. It can cover the act of actually giving and also renunciation. As I said earlier, renunciation is giving up your fascination with sensual thoughts. You find your happiness instead in the practice of concentration. You want to have the concentration as your food as you go through life. Of course, you don't have as much time to practice concentration when you're outside of the monastery as you would in the monastery, but you actively have to make time for your meditation because the world doesn't make time for you. This may mean little meditation breaks as you go through the day, as well as having a part of the day when you devote it totally to the practice. The same point goes with generosity, the act of giving. You actively give of your time, you give of your material wealth, you give of your energy, you give of your knowledge. You want to go out of your way to find opportunities to give as much as you can. The Buddha advises that you not harm yourself as you give. In other words, you don't give so much that you're depleted by it. At the same time, you don't harm others by the way you give things. In other words, if you give something to a monk, make sure it's the kind of thing the monk can use and maintain his precepts. There's a lot that goes into giving, and devoting yourself to giving is one of the ways you can find enjoyment in the practice, as you try to be creative in deciding what you have that you can give and how you can give it. What would be really appropriate for the person receiving it? That expands your mind. Finally, there's calm, which covers endurance and equanimity. These two are related, but they're not quite the same thing. Equanimity is an evenness in your attitude in the face of good and bad things. Endurance is the ability to put up with bad things and not retaliate. There are a lot of things we have to endure in this life. You want to make sure you're not aiming at getting back at others for the things you have to endure. The more you develop this endurance, then the more you can deal with problems of pain in your own meditation. Have the attitude, okay, negative things are going to come up. It's a natural part of the world, but you don't have to wound yourself around them. In every case, all these perfections are a matter of making your mind larger than the situation as you maintain a larger perspective, a sense of larger strength, as in the images the Buddha gives for goodwill. Your mind is like earth. The people who are abusing you are like a little man coming along with a hoe and a bucket. He's going to dig the earth and spit on the earth and piss on the earth, saying, "Be without earth, be without earth." But because he's so small and puny and the earth is so large, he's never going to succeed. You want your goodwill and endurance to be that large. You can make your goodwill like space. People can try to write things in space, but there's no place for what they're writing to stick. You want a mind that's not sticky. In other words, people are going to do unskillful things. They're going to say unskillful things. It's a natural part of the world, but you don't fasten on it. You keep your mind large. This is why we say that it's not a matter of bringing the Dhamma into your daily life. It's more a matter of bringing your daily life into the Dhamma. Let the Dhamma be larger, because it is.